You've mentioned the
Yeah.
source of information to sort of measure these benchmarks are from Deepseek themselves and their
Yeah.
research papers. And the question is, can we trust an organization's own assessment of themselves, as opposed to, especially given that now, like you say, a lot of people out there don't even know exactly what they are doing, where they came from. They can't really confirm, they can't tell, they've not been able to run their independent research to validate these benchmarks as to whether they meet them. The only way we can do this is to look at it from the back. From the back door is to look at it through their own research papers. So, should we take these assessments with a pinch of salt, or based on the interface and some of the things that you've interacted with, you think, yeah, even if there are some shortfalls, it's not that huge. They are actually hitting the targets to a decent extent.
I think I think I think they were clever enough to foresee things like this, right? Questions like this, and I think that's why they, yeah, and I think that's why they decided to open source the work,
Yeah,
right? Because like when they open source the work, they put it out there for anybody to take it and say, hey, look, we are not like hiding whatever we are doing behind like some veil of secrecy or whatever.
yeah,
This is what we are doing, and. I think they've been doing this like right from like because when you told me that, oh, you wanted us to do an episode on this, I
yeah.
was like, I don't want to come in like disappoint. So I went back to read like from their version 1.5, right? And like right from their version
Yeah,
1.5, like they started talking about the GPUs they were using,
yeah,
right? Then from there, then they moved on to like the hours it took to
yeah.
train. Then they moved to like the cost it took to train. So like they've been very open
Oh,
on
okay,
it. And then they keep saying like in order to foster like the research space and grow research, they are open sourcing it. So then anybody can take it and say, are these guys lying? Are these guys telling
okay.
the truth? And I think that's what has literally helped
Okay,
them. Yeah.
okay. The second question I had, in terms of follow up, is you mentioned the two, let's say, strategies of training a model. The first strategy being giving it highly fine tuned information and data to consume. And then the second one, reinforcing answers, as in if it's correct, you reinforce it. If it's wrong, you downplay it. Given that they use the reinforcement mechanism, how efficient is that? Because then I'm thinking, I would, from a user's point of view, I'll probably feel a lot more comfortable if I know AI is giving all the right answers, and when I ask it, it's just going to pour out those right answers to me, versus a thinking model where there are reinforcement mechanisms that were used. How expansive do these reinforcement trainings cover? And can we trust it? Or should we always be skeptical of the answers that AI give us? And if we should, then why all the hype and frenzy about it to begin with?
So I think for based on my perspective, right, and why I think the reinforcement thing sounds great is because if if we constantly train like AI based on or like these large language models based on like the data we give it and
Yeah.
see this is the answer we want, right? Then we miss out on that reasoning capability that we want to be able to grow,
Okay.
right? Because we have to understand that like the goal of DeepSeek, right, was to build on the reasoning capability, the ability for the model to reason through its process and see like be able to stop and say, okay, now maybe I'm doing something wrong. I have to like go back and then like reevaluate my answers. And I think they even got to the point where they saw that like they had like in their paper they described as like an aha moment
Okay.
where it was asked to prove something like a math equation, and as it was going, it realized that no. Then it went back
Started
to like
again.
wait, then went back to start all over again to be able to derive the answer. And I think they do this brilliantly. And the way they do this is so they have like a separate model, right? Where they so when they had the base, the V3, they started with like a previous model with the
Yeah.
V3. So when they had that base, then they started purely reinforcement learning, right? So
Okay.
what they had done was that they had like a reward model that would reward like answers after the model gives out its
Yeah.
answers. But then what they did differently was that this time instead of saying, okay, this answer is correct, this answer is wrong, discard all the other answers, they let the reward model ascribe like points to like
Oh,
a group of answers that the model brings
okay.
out, right? So if you say you bring out like five answers, then it ascribes like maybe one is correct, and then like the lower it gets is wrong, right? So maybe one, 0.4, 0.8, zero point
Yeah.
0.5. And then the model looks at that and then says, okay, these are correct, these are wrong. Then it learns from
Okay.
it. It learns from the and like yeah, so that's what they did. And I think that helped them because once they got to that aha moments, then basically we are seeing that then we can be able to develop like further develop and further fine-tune the machine's ability to reason without necessarily giving them the answer directly,
Yeah.
right? And I think that like that's the ultimate goal, right? To be able to have machines ability or like to be able to reason and think through like problems without just spitting out answers, right?
Yeah. The final question on this is there a risk to AI reasoning, right? Because like I think of it as then we don't have to give it all the right answers, but we trust it to use a reasoning mechanism to come up with the right answers, right? And does that mean there's some form of a risk in that process that users should always be aware of, that this is reasoning on its own and it might not always come up with the right answer for whatever question you ask? Because I don't think I don't think AI developers, maybe I may be wrong, but I don't think AI developers can predict every single potential use case scenario of that AI, right? And so people use it for
Yeah.
all sorts of things. And if you are training it on reasoning and eventually you don't go on a particular reasoning line, I think this will probably be the better question. If you train it on a data set or reasoning mechanisms that doesn't cover a specific issue, and somebody asks it about that issue, technically, how would it go about thinking about it, given that it's probably never encountered it before, and answering that person?
I think that's one of the like that's one of the like biggest issues facing like large language
Yeah,
models, like the problem of like
yeah,
hallucinations, right? So like you ask a model something and you ask like ChatGPT something and say, yes, I know about XYZ. Then it begins like bring out like all sorts of things and say this is the answer, right? But you look at it and you're
nah,
like, no, not really. Like that's not what I mean,
yeah,
right? And I think that's one of the issues that's facing like large language models. There are certain like models, like I think Claude from Anthropic, right?
yeah,
I think Claude wouldn't give you an answer if it doesn't know an answer. And I think that's what they set out to do. Like that was their goal,
yeah,
right? To like Anthropic, I think it was like I think something on um equity, equality, like one of those things, like basically like fair AI, right?
yeah,
So for their model, it doesn't do those things. If it doesn't have an answer, it's going to tell it doesn't have an answer, or it's not in the capacity to be able to answer. But outside of that, I think yeah, like we can't still have instances where um because we can't account for everything. Like we can't account for the intention of every single
yeah,
person, right? So these are questions that we'll still need to be able to answer. But I think it's actually a step in like one direction where at least like we give something to like to the machine, and instead of it like going off on a tangent of like spewing things that it has no idea about. Now, instead of it just spewing things it has no idea about, it's able to like reason or think like how a human being would
yeah,
like think about something, right? So provided it has like some little context about something, it can say, okay, per the context I have about this, probably this is XYZ, right? As opposed to it saying total nonsense,
yeah.
right? But I mean it's something we can be able to get to. I think that's what we are trying to get to,
Yeah.
right? The whole AGI like point, right? And I think we can get there. It's just a matter of time.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Let's get away a little bit from AI and people using it. One thing I don't get about all of this is how some people are losing money. Like, yeah, somebody is successful. What's the point? Continue your success. And that I think that has been one of the biggest reasons why this has been such a major conversation, because you look at OpenAI, you look at Meta, you look at Microsoft, you look at Nvidia, all of them have their stocks downhill, right? And it's like it doesn't make sense to me. How does the success of one company translate into the downfall of another? And I don't know if you could explain. exactly how the markets work in the tech world. Because in my mind, if somebody is successful, hooray, continue their success, then let somebody also enjoy their trajectory. But now it's like somebody's success automatically becomes somebody's downfall in financial sense.
So and this is the thing, right? So I was listening to like a podcast, like I think Weights, it was on like the Weights and Biases like YouTube channel,
Yeah.
right? And like this guy was talking about how in the S&P 500, like seven companies accounts for like I think 33% of like the S&P 500 in the United States.
Okay.
And out of that, also even when you come to like the Nasdaq is like the tech stock, the tech stock index, right?
Yeah.
Also, there are like a few companies that control about 30, like a third of that, right? And when you look at these companies, each of these companies, what they realize, what I've seen or realized is that their golden goose is like cloud infrastructure.
Okay.
So Microsoft has Azure, Amazon has AWS, right? I don't know if Meta does Meta. I don't really know if Meta
Yeah.
has like a cloud platform. But like when you look at that has been their golden goose. And then that's without what like fuels like things from Nvidia, because these guys are wanting to like improve, because there's this assumption that if I don't grow my data centers and improve on my cloud computing, um Microsoft is going to do it. So
Okay.
I need to beat Microsoft.
Okay.
So like that, so like Google, Microsoft, all of these companies are trying to build their infrastructure, right? And the reason why we saw that tank was because already there were claims that like Nvidia stocks already were overpriced, right?
Yeah.
People like in the echo chamber, some people were like Nvidia stocks are too overpriced. But then we have to also understand, if that's the claim, right? Then it means that that bubble it's very, very shaky.
Yeah.
It's the slight change will disrupt anything within it. And that comes back to the computation, like the computation and the cost thing, right? Because if everybody has been living off the assumption that Nvidia stocks are only going to rise because AI companies are always going to try to scale and scale and
Yeah.
scale, right? And because of what they've told us, for you to be able to scale your model, you need high compute resource. So we see the Stargates thing, for example, when these guys announced the six, I think 600 or 500 billion in dollars. Like I think it was Nvidia, Microsoft, I think Oracle and
Yeah.
OpenAI. They are SoftBank. They announced that like and like a bunch of other companies that they are $500 billion into building data centers.
Oh, okay.
Right after that announcement, within that same week, was when Deepseek released the R1 and released their benchmarks and everything, and say, look, we don't need this amount of money to be able to reach these benchmarks,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So now, because of how the stock market, because of how the stock market literally acts, these things act based on sentiment. So
Yeah.
you'd be like, okay, so it means in the future we will not need as much Nvidia stocks, as much Nvidia
Yeah.
GPUs as we have been made to believe, right? And these guys are already trading once, even when there was training their models, even when there was a ban on like China receiving the high-end Nvidia
Yeah.
GPUs, right? So all those things will cause people to want to sell, 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 right? And that was what contributed to it. I think the only people that didn't suffer from the whole crash was Meta, I think Apple,
Yeah.
right? And I think Apple was because Apple was pushing this high idea of having like being able to have like models on your phone, running like models on your local resource, and that's literally what DeepSeek was aiming
Yeah.
for. I think Meta, sorry, didn't like see the hits because they started the whole open source thing.
Yeah.
Like the open source is one of the largest like dense models, right? So they didn't really see the impacts like that, right? But even moving aside from like the tech companies, the other people that like so yeah, like moving us, like there are
Yeah.
people that were at there somewhere and they were also hit, like energy
Yeah.
companies, right? Because we have to understand that the whole thing it's not just on GPUs, it's on energy,
Yeah.
right? It takes energy to be able to run all these
Oh,
data
okay.
centers, right? So a lot of energy companies, like nuclear companies and all of those things, also saw their stocks being hit. So like that thing, that little thing from the small Chinese group that came out, like literally shake people,
This
like literally, and
this is one of these things where you're like, it's like you wish it was a kid that lived on your block that you could just walk down the street, catch them,
yeah,
and give them a heavy knock.
Yes. I think there was this one thing. I think I saw this post on Twitter when like there was this I think like a researcher or like a lead from OpenAI came
Yeah.
out and was like, "Oh, it's a good thing to see that DeepSeek have come out with O- O1 like level benchmarks and stuff like that." And there was this like intern from DeepSeek that came out and was like, I think he quoted a tweet and was like, "So why didn't you open source yours? Like, so why didn't you do it?" Right? And then, like,
Yeah, I think
so like it's like a good day to be in the space,
a
right?
lot of people also just are happy that OpenAI is being hit because they felt when they came out initially and said they were a non-profit and then eventually did a U-turn and said, well, they are ending the non-profit at some point and then starting a for-profit. And it's like people, so people have always felt excluded from accessing the very best versions of ChatGPT. And so to have DeepSeek bring out the very best versions similar to the best versions of ChatGPT and open source it and make it free without any payments, they are like, aha, now now ChatGPT should be hit. So that they realize that excluding the masses was a problem. Yeah.
I think I'm not too sure like OpenAI is a publicly traded. I think if they were publicly
No,
traded, they would have been like
they would have been
down
down.
during that week. Yeah, yeah, they would have been down. Yeah.
Anyway, there are a few more questions I have on this technical aspect before we move to the reason why these two countries or these. In fact, I was watching a video yesterday and I also heard Vladimir Putin made a statement that whoever controls AI controls the world. And sometimes I just feel like nations make these statements unless maybe after this conversation we get to uncover exactly how AI is fundamental to some of the things that they do. Sometimes I just feel like they want to fuel each other's egos and just battle each other for something pointless. So let's finish up with this technical aspect. Um, DeepSeek says they used inferior versions of Nvidia's chips. They didn't use the best versions of Nvidia's chips because obviously of the ban. And at the time, the US's idea was to try and the notion was you can never achieve the levels of ChatGPT and OpenAI without these high-end chips. And so if they ban these high-end chips, then Chinese companies would always be 1 year or 2 years below. And these guys then decided to say, okay, maybe the hardship is probably the room to just find a way around it. And it is in finding a way around it that they've discovered an AI model that is as efficient as the best versions in the US, but uses much more inferior chips. At least that's what they claim. OpenAI also says it is they've copied them, right? In fact, Sam Altman somewhere in December made a tweet and said, "These guys literally, it's easier to copy something than to be the first person to do it and take the risk." And according to him, when DeepSeek started, when you go there and ask, "What model are you?" it responds by saying, "I am ChatGPT something something model," and all that. And so the question I'm asking is, can we actually trust if you look at the computing model and the efficiency, can you really trust that these guys used inferior versions of NVIDIA chips to do it?
So in their bid to be open source,
Yeah,
like so they put out, I think I think in their earlier like paper,
yeah,
I think the V1.5, the version
yeah,
1.5. What they said was that they trained on clusters of the A100 and the
yeah,
H800s. Oh yeah, or 100. Yeah, I think one of them. I think the A100 is a high end chip,
yeah,
right? It's a high-end GPU, right? So when I was reading that part, I was like, like how did you get it? Because like you released that paper in like I think somewhere in January
yeah,
2024, right? And what I know was that the ban was somewhere in like October 2022 thereabouts. So just for that A100 chip, right? A100 chip, it's a high-end model. It was part of the ones that were
yeah,
banned, right? So then my question was maybe they had like some sort of stocks or they saw into the future and were like, let's hide some of these things and then use them to trade. But like then again, we can't tell, right?
yeah,
Because we can only tell from what they give to us. And because of their whole claim that they are open source once again, it's forces us like there's that then there becomes that inclination to wants to trust
Yeah.
them, right? Because they put their model and everything out there. The other thing, and I think that's on the like the whole if you ask the model thing, like what it is, and
Yeah.
I'll tell you GPT, yeah. It was also because they said they trained it on XYZ data, but they don't tell us the data set. They don't
Yeah.
show us the data set. So then that begs the question, like, what data sets did they train? Because now you have to understand, like, in this day and age, what is going to become a commodity? And I think even previously, right, in terms of like art, the times when
Yeah.
like arts were like a big thing was
Yeah.
data, right? So like then that also becomes a question, like, what data sets were you training on? Because all they tell us was that they train on Chinese and English like data sets. They don't show us the data sets, and that's like another question
So they are not
that still
truly
needs to be
open
answered.
source.
But as to the chips, yeah, because like I mean, if you're open to like publish
Yeah.
the data and
They
let
are
us also
open
see the
source by
data it gives,
name.
right? Yes. So like publish the data and let us also see the data
Yeah.
set you use. And I think that's where the claim, that's where OpenAI can also make that claim and say, like probably they use our like these like parts of our models or they use like inputs from our models to be able to train
Yeah.
themselves. And I think that's also another question. So although they are open source, there are still a lot of questions we can ask because if the first of them if the ban was in 2022 and you release the paper in 2024 and you still have one of the GPUs in your cluster that was like part of the ban, then like where did you get it from, right?
Yeah.
So that's another question. And I think a lot of like the hype around the recent release has like removed attention from their previously released papers because when you go back to read their previously released papers then begin to ask yourself like all these questions
Yeah.
and those are things I asked myself and became like started uncovering,
Yeah.
right? Because they tell us like I think they tell us, oh, we've been able to develop a model that change like less, right? And that uses like less cost, blah blah blah, right? But then you go and look at it and be like, okay, so that 5.76 or $5.86 million that we're talking about was only for the V3. They don't talk about training costs
The R1.
on the R1, right? On the most recent one, right? Or the
Yeah.
R10. So and also in the paper, they talk about how, like, with the kind of like model that they like, the type of learning that they
Yeah.
use, you need to like expose it, like train it more to be able to ensure that like you increase the reasoning capability.
Yeah.
So it probably means that
That's
six
also
million might have
yeah,
shot up,
cost
right?
intensive.
Right. Yeah, it might have shot up. Like, but we don't know how long they trained it for, right? They don't tell us how long they trained it for. So then that's also another question. So like probably it might have been cheaper,
Yeah.
right? Maybe it might have been cheaper than what's like than like the 6 billion OpenAI
Yeah.
raise or the 10 billion OpenAI like raise, right? But then again, it might not have
Six
been like
million.
as
Yeah.
cheap as you want us to
Yeah.
believe, right? Yeah, maybe you're like leading us on, but like it might have been cheaper. But at
Yeah.
least like if you are saying they are open, so I think they should also publish all of those things. Like so we trained it for this amount of hours for the RL and
Yeah.
all of those things, right?
I mean, this is quite interesting because I listen to the way in which the general media is pushing out these facts that is they only train it on 6 million. They use very inferior Nvidia chips, and I was wondering, are we really sure this is true? Because I know the general media would always want to be the ones to jump on the train because it's hot news, publish it and go away. But from what you are saying, and which is also one of the reasons why I was like, let's do an episode on it because I definitely, in fact, if I go and pick those papers, I won't read it and enjoy it. I won't read it and enjoy it. But you are interested in the space, you were already commenting on some of the things, and you felt, this guy is obviously reading way beyond what the average person is reading. So let's have a conversation about it. And like you're saying, you've seen that they were at some point using even higher end chips. The cost is not fully reported. And so which also means that the public has been led on, or the frenzy has been built on information that's sort of leading people on, basically. And those are the things that are making the headlines as well. So it's sort of like yeah, a little pinch of salt in here.
I think they do well. I think they do well to try to get that reaction, right? Because
Yeah.
when you take a look at their paper, right, like right after the abstract, I think right after the abstract, then the benchmarks are there. Like for I think they did it for the V3. Like so then the benchmarks
Yeah.
are there. Like this is how we performed when you put us against others.
Yeah.
So obviously it's going to be like, hey, like do you get it? And then that's the question because they do a lot of training, and that's the truth. They do a lot of training
Yeah.
because this is how they got a V3 to be that good, right? they built V3, trained it right
Mm.
with SFT, like the fine tuning, the supervised fine
Yeah.
tuning. Then they use V3 to train
Oh,
R10,
okay.
right? And then after they train R10, then they train R1 again
Okay.
with like data like fine tuning and like a combination and everything. Then after they train R1, then they use R1 and distill it into V3.
Ah,
So they do a
okay.
lot of training,
Okay.
right? So, yeah, so they did a lot of
Okay.
training, right? And the only time they reported cost was on V3,
Yeah.
was on the paper they released on
Yeah.
V3. Nothing on cost was said on R1
R1
or
zero. Okay.
R10,
Okay.
right?
Okay. Interesting. And given that
Yeah. I
R1,
think the only reason,
yeah, given that R1 and R1 zero are probably much more powerful versions of their releases, it's also reasonable to think those ones could cost slightly more than V3. um, unless maybe they found some genius ways of doing it. But let's see, maybe in the coming weeks or days, the full information might come out, and, and then when it does, we can see exactly how it plays out.